Well, hello everyone and welcome. My name's Stuart Taylor and I'm the Publishing Director at the Royal Society. I've also recently joined the Board of Directors of OASPA and it's my pleasure to chair this afternoon's OASPA webinar on the economics and sustainability of open access. I gather we've got a record attendance for this webinar, which is terrific and no doubt reflects the level of interest in this thorny topic. It's probably also due in part to the increased focus on open access in recent weeks following the announcement of Plan S and all the lively discussion that's caused. So it seems pretty clear that the scholarly communication is moving inexorably in a more open direction, and I think it's safe to say probably that the case for open access has now been well established and accepted, at least by most people. However, we're still some way from a consensus on the practicalities of how we actually get there. We started with repository-based solutions in parallel with traditional subscriptions back in the 90s, of course. In the mid-2000s, we added open access publishing via journals, and now we're seeing the rise of preprints and the launches of funder and institution platforms. There are also many library-led and scholar-led initiatives going on around the world. But given the wide diversity of cultures across the various academic disciplines and the various needs of those disciplines, we'll surely be needing a similar diversity of approaches to delivering open access. But how will they be paid for? Who will pay for them? How sustainable will they be? What sort of business models are we going to need? There are also, of course, marked differences around the world in the willingness and ability to pay for open access from funders, from universities, from governments, and so on. So to dig into these issues a little, we've got three great speakers today who come from a nice mix of backgrounds and who all have different perspectives. So I can't promise we'll get to any definitive answers in the hour we've got, but I'm sure we'll have a very interesting discussion on the way there. So each of the speakers will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then after we've heard from all of them, it will be over to you for a discussion of the issues raised and any questions that you have. You can submit your questions in the chat panel, so you should see a little balloon icon to open that up if you haven't already got it. The questions will only be seen by me and by the panelists, and I will then pick from those and relay them onto the panelists for discussion. So our first speaker is Liz Ferguson. Liz is Vice President of Editorial Development at Wiley. Previously, she was the Publishing Solutions Director and Editorial Director for Life Science Journals at Wiley, with a focus on organismal biology, and she was a member of the group that conceived of and launched the Wiley Open Access Journals program. Prior to that, she's worked for Blackwell Publishing, for Lippincott, Williams & Wilkins, Thomson Science, and Current Science. So, Liz, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Stuart, and thanks also to OASPA for organising this terrific series of webinars and to CTC for the practical support, which is terrifically helpful. I'm going to be talking about the economic implications of open access, largely from the perspective of a large and mixed model publisher, and I'm also going to focus, because of time constraints today, on gold or APC-driven open access. But I say that, obviously, against the backdrop and a future of widespread and ubiquitous open access that have to lie in a mix of models reflecting the different trajectories and scholarly traditions of different communities and customers. So with my gold disclaimer firmly lodged, I'm going to focus in these next 10 minutes on the real and very practical considerations publishers are having to make, how we can try to make informed decisions, and the economic impacts, intended or otherwise, that we may experience on the way to a sustainable open access future. Now, as Stuart said earlier, there's a lot of people on this line, more than before, so I'm going to take the opportunity to begin with some baseline information. So first of all, open access still delivers less than 5% of the global revenues, which are about $10 billion, generated by journals publishing. And that despite open access output now accounting for significantly more than 20% of all research output. And the difference lies largely in platinum and other models of support for open access that don't have revenues associated with them, and also because revenues per article are typically lower for open access than for subscription content. However, open access continues to grow faster than any other revenue stream or than any other cost to the payer, depending on your perspective, in scholarly publishing. Earlier this week, Delta Think put likely growth for next year at around 5%, and Simba most recently estimated a compound annual growth rate of around 10% for the last couple of years versus overall growth in scholarly journal revenues of about 2%. In the last couple of years, we've also seen the largest 3 publishers consolidate their positions with respect to share of APC revenues globally. So Springer Nature has been top for some time, with reported revenues of close to $140 million from APCs in 2017. An update from Elsevier put their open access output at around 20,000 articles in 2016, with revenues of approximately $40 million and strong growth in hybrid. Wiley is third, and our own open access growth, both articles and revenues, are now being driven primarily by full gold open access. Behind those 3 come the large open access only publishers, PLOS, Hindawi, and MDPI filling the next few slots. Now, further evidence for that consolidation comes from the recent 2017 Universities UK report on the transition to OA in the UK, and that reported that half of all UK expenditure on APCs went to the largest 3 publishers, and PLOS was the only of the full OA publishers to make the top 5. Now, for the most part, open access revenues have been incremental to the other revenue streams of mixed model publishers. There's been some subscription price modification to deal with double dipping, and publishers have been flipping titles from subscription to OA, but the economic impact really has been pretty modest until publishers started to experiment more recently with offsetting and even published deals. Now, the Royal Society's Gold for Gold program was one of the earliest of these, and in recognition of their subscription business, participating institutions were given tokens for faculty to publish hybrid OA, and from the outside, this seemed to be a really well-received program, both by researchers and by institutions. Wiley established an offsetting model based on credits with JISC, again in the UK, in 2015. Institutions in that model receive credits and discounts in any given year towards open access, hybrid and full gold, based on the total value of their previous year's subscription and OA expenditure with us. Again, it was largely welcomed by institutions as a pilot model, but it's got some financial and administrative complexity behind it that means it's unlikely to be repeated. But the common feature of these and some of the other early offsetting deals is that they traded discounts or even provided open access for free while shoring up subscription revenues. So that kind of deal structure helped accelerate take-up of OA, but with the benefit of hindsight, we may view this as short-sighted as open access becomes a much larger part of the publishing economy. So since then, publishers have continued to adapt their models to changing conditions. Some continue to offer APC discounts on parts or all of their program. Others are moving to what are now commonly called read and publish agreements that combine the costs of subscription and OA publishing, both hybrid and full gold again for eligible authors and readers. And a couple of the early moves were made by the Institute of Physics Publishing in Austria and the UK. Springer subsequently introduced its Springer Compact arrangement, and a good number of similar deals now exist, largely in Northern Europe. Now, in the last 12 to 24 months, for reasons Stuart has already outlined, pressure has intensified. Increasing numbers of customers are insisting on an OA component to their deals, and their insistence can have a real and direct economic impact when publishers don't accede to or don't at least make some progress towards the requirement of those customers. And there's been some very public disputes and high-profile cancellations as a consequence. Now, I'm going to make a leaping assumption now that most people on this call are going to agree that the market is on a trajectory to permanent change of some sort. And there's been a lot of talk about Plan S recently for obvious reasons. I'm glad Stuart invoked Plan S first. With its current signatories, and I say current because I feel there will be more, I think that that's a generally held belief, Plan S covers a little over 3% of global research output. Now, for Wiley, it's about 4% of our published output, but the impact at the individual journal level varies from nothing at all to a very substantial proportion indeed of content. Now, as a publisher of several hundred individual society journals, we have to factor that kind of different balance into all of our strategic and economic decisions, and so do the partners who own those journals and rely on them for their well-being. On average, though, 4% doesn't sound too seismic. But once we start to add in the article output of those institutional customers who are also pushing hard to include a strong OA component to their deals, we start to see scenarios in which we could move from 10 to 20% of the content we publish being OA. And I'm sure the number isn't that radically different for other mid to large-size mixed model publishers. And at that scale, we're forced to start looking in detail at future scenarios, and we use a number of key assumptions to do that. Now, the first of those is that customer demand for OA is not going away. The second is that that demand manifests itself as moving expenditure as well as publishing activity from subscription to OA. And third, that the underlying demand for publishing and publishing services remains strong. So we're combining those and some other assumptions with market analysis and detailed conversations with customers and society partners and other stakeholders to do some in-depth modeling, and I'm sure that most other publishers are too. So the modeling obviously takes into account subscription revenues that we currently have, open access revenues that we currently have, secondary revenues derived from rights and licensing, commercial sales, and so on. It looks at the investments that might be needed to deal with open access at a greater scale than we manage now. It looks at article outputs and the timing of when different deals and what types of deals might reach conclusion, whether those conclusions are satisfactory or not. All of those different factors help us chart our future and provide us with the market and economic insight we need to make decisions about that future. And that work also creates a wide range of scenarios for us to explore and to test out. Now, Stuart asked me to address whether I thought a wholesale flip was on the cards, and my answer to that is no, or at least not yet. At the very least, though, publishers have to continually monitor, review, and adapt as we begin to experience the economic consequences, both positive and more challenging, of this changing environment. But within that, there are also some general implications that we can draw. So first, migration of content from subscription to open access is likely to put more pressure on subscriptions globally. Now, some customers with publish and read agreements consider that as they are the ones paying for subscription and open access costs to be offset against one another, the rest of the world should not assume that it should also benefit from those customers' investments. Now, that is a much, much harder argument for a publisher to make than it is for an institution. Additionally, we know that one of the principles of Plan S is to cap APCs. Now, I remain to be convinced that this is an effective way to create a vibrant and a sustainable market. It's simply a fact well known to many on this call, I'm sure, that highly selective journals that seek to represent the very best of their domain, those that offer a high touch and superior author service, and those that continually innovate have a significantly higher cost base than those with different characteristics. I don't believe that it's in the interests of research or researchers to constrain those, and I also don't believe that it's in anyone's interest to constrain journals with those characteristics from flipping, and that could be one unintended consequence of capping of APCs. A second unintended consequence, which I think works in reverse to the intent of a cap, may be that publishers of journals priced below the caps feel that they can now be incentivized to raise their prices closer to the cap. So for those reasons and others besides, I believe that market forces rather than regulation are a better way to shape an effective market. So the second thing that is clear is that some publishers have excelled in their delivery of OA support services to institutions, to authors, and to funders, but we all have further investment to make. Now, if revenues come under pressure, publishers are going to need to find further efficiencies in order to support those investments. And an article-based economy is also going to require publishers more than ever to put researchers front and center of their service delivery and the development of those services. That has to become a differentiator for a successful publisher. So furthermore, investment is going to be needed to ensure that journals continue to innovate, especially with services that improve transparency and that drive beyond open access to integrate with and support the broader world of open science. Now, third, if we consider the current market dominance that the largest publishers have in open access, together with that need for investment and against a backdrop of more challenging revenues, we can see further consolidation ahead. Transitional negotiations are one part of the challenge for smaller entities. Stuart made me aware that the Royal Society was unable to reach a full publish and read agreement with Max Planck purely because they didn't have sufficient scale in publishing output rather than a lack of willingness or intent on either side. Another pointer towards consolidation is the number of acquisitions of open access publishers by mid and large-sized publishers in the recent past. The acquisitions by Taylor and Francis of both Coaction and Dove, for example. So consolidation or not, complexity is going to continue to characterize this market. To my mind, there's a real tension between what a large number of customers are telling us they want, read and publish deals for some, more flexible green for others, while funders are adopting a position that hybrid is at the end of the road. Those three things are really difficult to draw together. Now, we know that gold doesn't suit the behaviors or funding patterns of all disciplines or all content types, so alternative routes to satisfying OA are also going to have to be found for some domains or for some journal types, and we need to engage in more experimentation. We, like some others, including the RSC, are piloting differential APCs in some regions to see if there's a level of APC-driven open access which non-Western or global South communities may be able to participate. I'm watching with interest the success of projects like the Open Library of Humanities, and I'm really keen to see how a similar project is going to turn out at annual reviews. But it's challenging to see how those models can be extensible to the larger publishers. Now, because coming up with models that satisfy all those demands is going to be so complex and challenging, it's hard to see a transition period being particularly economically efficient. We are moving, likely moving, from a flat but very predictable market to one where the nature and the rate and the impact of change are all really challenging to predict. So in closing, I want to say that there's multiple ongoing implications for the economics of publishers and other stakeholders in the short term, and on the ability of everyone involved to plan for sustainability in the long term. The endpoint will be sustainable for many involved today. I have no doubt of that, but the challenge is going to lie in getting us there. And with that, I will hand back to Stuart.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Liz. Very useful to have the perspective of a large commercial publisher, and thanks for sticking to time, and also some very nice pictures in those slides, I thought. Now, next we're going to go to somebody with a very different set of perspectives, I think, and background, and that's Claudio Aspesi. Claudio is an independent consultant in the media and publishing industry. Between 2004 and 2016, he was the senior research analyst at Sanford C. Bernstein, covering European media stocks. Before that, he was global senior VP of strategy at EMI Music and was responsible for defining EMI's business model as the music industry entered the digital age. Before joining EMI, he was a member of the executive team at AirClick, an internet infrastructure company. And prior to that, he was a principal partner at McKinsey & Company, working with many leading media and entertainment companies. Claudio graduated with highest honors from Università Luigi Bocconi in Milan, and with a laurea in Economia and Aziendale. I apologize for my appalling Italian there, Claudio. Anyway, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody, first of all, and thank you for finding the time to listen to all of us. I would like to start from something that Liz did not mention, but she wrote in one of the slides. She pointed out that it is difficult to make predictions. So at the cost of making a fool of myself, in the next 10 or 15 minutes, I will try to do exactly that and make some comments on the future sustainability of open access. It is, in fact, what one would call predictions. However, to do that, one needs to start from the current state of the industry. So the way I will describe the industry is that of a somewhat paranoid and schizophrenic industry based on individual contributions, but really very much affected by the decision to bundle those contributions. Those contributions start, like in many other media businesses, from the economics of printing. It made a lot of sense back when journals were distributed physically to try to capture as many customers as possible by adding content, and scale economies in printing and binding and distribution made even more logical to assemble all that content in the form of journals. Ultimately, however, each of the contributions should stand on its own merits. That is one of the underlying principles of this industry, but it's one that's contradicted by the fact that the industry sells bundles. It measures the performance of bundles called journals through the impact factor, and it's now, in fact, selling bundles of bundles as the traditional journal has been substituted by collections with multiple titles inside of it. The contradiction comes from the fact that not all content is indeed equal. There's not a vast amount of publicly available data on usage and readership of articles, but there is some. So a few years ago, 10 universities in the UK aggregated their readership data for journals in life sciences and chemistry. And what you see on the slide is the aggregate data for life sciences. As you can see on the right-hand side, the bottom 50% of the journals account for something like 3 to 8% of the readership. Of course, there will be some overlooked treasures in the long tail of rarely accessed journals. They likely are to be few. It is a real wonder that so much still gets published for no discernible benefit, at least to the people who buy the journals through their subscriptions. This leads me to the question whether it makes sense to have an industry predicated on publishing vast amounts of articles which will go unread. From a business perspective, and I'm talking strictly from a business perspective, if we were to start a scholarly communication industry today, we would have very few or no journals at all. Certainly, articles will be published when they're ready for publication, rather than on the rather curious schedule of 2, 4, 6 days a year when all the content is made available. We will continue to update them as comments and additional work suggest the changes and improvements to the content of those articles. We would have standards across the industry for metadata to facilitate search, and we will most certainly value articles based on their individual contributions rather than the contribution of the articles which preceded it over the years. From an economic point of view, subscription journals may only make sense for that elite 5 to 10% of the journals which are showed on the left-hand side of the previous slide, the journals which have enough readers to justify spreading their costs among many people. There is no economic justification, on the other hand, for a subscription model to a long tail of journals which nobody reads. Hence, open access becomes an attractive and, in fact, important business model to publish everything else. I want to underline one point. I am saying this strictly from a business aspect. There are perfectly legitimate reasons to wish that even high readership journals are available in open access. Those reasons are ethical, they're political, they may be linked to the self-interest of authors, but they're not business arguments. From a strictly business argument perspective, there is no subscription model that should support 60 to 70% of the journals. Hence, there is very little scope for them to stay in a subscription model. Hence, they need to transition to open access at some point. Now, the question becomes which open access model should then prevail? And there is no easy answer. I'm now going to discuss many of the competing models which are emerging. I argue that there is no reason to have journals, and in fact, there is a lot of experimentation that subverts the journal model altogether. Rupert, after me, will discuss them in much more depth. So I'm going to stick to making predictions based on what we can see today. And I will point out that there are many different stakeholders and that they have very different goals. some are very obvious. So if you're an open access publisher, you will be in favor of transitioning everything to open access, and you don't want to see any other model stay, in the hope that more and more revenues will come your way. Subscription publishers so far have been able to live with gold open access, provided there are some mechanisms in place which allow them to preserve their profitability. Liz pointed out earlier that prevailing APCs tend to be lower than what is the implicit revenue per article that subscription revenues afford the large publishers. So hybrid journals are a viable model for them. Caps to APCs or pure gold journals are a lot less attractive for anyone who has a large subscription business. But there are other stakeholders which still have to take very clear positions. I will focus on two of them. One is funding bodies, which have been agnostic until very recently on how to fulfill their open access mandate, assuming they have one. This is changing, as we all know, and they may have very important and negative implications for subscription publishers if they're counting on hybrid journals and on no caps to APCs. I will point to a second constituency, the university administrators. They are implicitly wedded to the existing model because impact factors provide very safe harbor for lots of core process decisions around hiring, promotions, tenure, and so forth, and on and so forth. It's a model that academia doesn't like. Speak to anyone in academia, they will all argue against it, but it's still a very useful model for administrations. If that doesn't change, administrations will not be at the forefront of any modification to the current industry structure. So which model will emerge? Making predictions, as I said, it's difficult, but let's look at some possible outcomes. One is that full open gold will remain a difficult transition to accept for subscription publishers. So I would expect them to continue to work very hard for hybrid journals to continue to be accepted forever by the funding bodies. And I would also expect them to argue, as we heard Liz earlier do, lobby against APC caps. Green open access will be very efficient, but to really affect in a substantial way the industry, it needs embargo periods to go away. The experience where long embargo periods exist, like the National Institutes of Health policy, is that even with very high compliance rates, the subscription model has not been dented. Stuart tells me that the Royal Society experience is fundamentally similar. So I believe that much depends ultimately on the funding bodies. If they decide to flex their muscle, they will shape this industry in a very short period of time. If they do not, then I think that the scenario that Liz pointed out to earlier, a scenario of fragmentation of many different models living next to each other, may continue. That's what Liz effectively referred to when she indicated and she used the words market forces. But market forces may not be the only deciders. Governments can also be involved. One of the arguments I will always point out to is that governments and their policies should also involve nonprofit but charities-funded research, because charities in many countries around the world have preferential tax treatment that's effectively subsidized by taxpayers. So any distinction between what is done with publicly funded research and what's privately funded but with tax benefits behind is a very fine distinction in my mind, and one that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I will assume that government and private funding bodies may ultimately start to align themselves, and they could align around a number of actions. They could take some what I call negative actions, disqualifying hybrid journals, imposing short or no embargo periods for green open access, refusing to pay more than maximum APCs. They can also take even more proactive actions. They can embrace, fund, and sustain alternative dissemination models, and Rupert will talk about some of them, and perhaps establish consortia which encourage even more experimentation. I would also hope that university administrations will actually actively demand article-level metrics as opposed to impact factors as a way to measure contributions of individual authors as a way to derive further change in the industry. Finally, one word. We haven't touched yet, and perhaps no one else will, on Sci-Hub, but we know that it is the elephant in the room. There is a possible scenario for the future in which researchers do not need subscriptions to access content they want, period. The experience of other elements of the media industry is that it's very difficult to fight some of these models. Copyright infringement is difficult to fight. Perhaps I'm particularly scarred by my music industry experience, but what happened to the music industry is that it took 15 years of revenue decline to fully accept and embrace the need to change the economic model. And only when enough revenues have been lost and enough jobs have been lost, it was finally willing to accept streaming subscriptions as an alternative model to long-established business practices. In that sense, I would argue that the scholarly communication industry, including the subscription publishers, may count themselves very lucky to have an alternative model available, because it may not be as palatable, it may not be as profitable as their model today, but it sure beats losing a substantial amount of revenues over a long downwards trajectory. I will stop here, and I will hand this over to Stuart again.
Claudio, thank you very much. It's certainly very refreshing to hear from somebody who's got experience of other industries that have had to negotiate some of the similar sorts of issues. So for our final speaker, we're actually going to go to an academic. Now, it does sometimes get leveled at the open access discussion that there aren't enough voices from academics and researchers themselves, so I hope we're going to redress that balance now. Also, you can wait your whole life for an economist and then two come along at once. So we've now got our final speaker is Dr. Rupert Gatti, who's a Fellow and Director of Studies in Economics at Trinity College, Cambridge, and a lecturer in the Faculty of Economics at the University of Cambridge. He's a Fellow of Trinity College, where he's Director of Studies in Economics, and his research interests include search theory, game theory, and the economic analysis of online markets. So, Rupert, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and thank you again, everybody, for putting this on and inviting me and attending. I just quickly add as well, while it's on the screen, that I also co-founded with a couple of other academics the Open Book Publishers, which, for those of you who don't know it, is a open access book publishing, scholarly book publishing company, which has been going now for 10 years, and I'll come back and discuss little bits of that as we go along the way as well. And my button isn't working. There we go. No, it's not. Sorry, there we go. I just wanted to sort of carry on from the really interesting discussions that have been thinking about what is it that we're trying to sustain. I guess quite a lot of the discussions that I've had in other settings, and it's been a much broader discussion today, but has often been around APCs and about how to support the existing publishing model. How do we support existing publishers and existing publishing methods, rather than really taking the view forward and thinking, so what's coming, what are the new business models, and how could we be changing business practices into the evolving new world that's there. So what I wanted to do was continue on and think through some scenario building that we've had built up by the other two speakers. Before doing so, I just wanted to raise, there is a huge, in both journals and books, there's an enormous, innovative, small-scale, scholarly-led publishing emerging, open access emerging, which doesn't involve APCs or book processing charges. I think most of the journals on the directory of open access journals do not have APCs, and there's a large number of book publishers emerging, of which we are one, who do not charge book processing charges either. There's also lots of different formats and different approaches that new publishers are bringing in, and so I've highlighted some of those new publishers. Open Humanities Press has been around for 10 years. Media Commons Press. These are coming up with new types of books, new ways of disseminating them, new ways of creating them. You've got organizations like Scalar, which are concentrating more on multimedia content. You've got Open Library of Humanities, we've heard before, and we've got bunches of new university presses, or presses being funded by universities in many cases, university-level objectives. And this is hitting the objectives of the institutions rather than the traditional publishing, separate third-party publishing that we've seen in the past. One of the things that I think is important is with the change in digital publishing environment, the costs have come down dramatically in being able to publish works. And this is reflected in lots of these innovative and new publishing processes that are coming out. One of the things that I'm scared about is that as we move forward, especially the scenario that I want to spell out, is that we will lose the ability of some of that innovation to keep developing and keep reaching content and developing new markets. So I think that the area that I really want to concentrate on is in publishing platforms and the emergence of publishing no longer as an idea of putting out some books and distributing the books, or running a journal and distributing the journal, but actually we've got wholesale digital platforms here. And this has emerged over the last 10, 15 years, primarily from journals, but it's moving into books as well, where there is a broad, it's not that publishers are necessarily looking to sell any of this as individual content. They're looking to sell access to an interaction with the platform in its entirety. It's what has become known as a big deal in some settings, but I think it's becoming an even bigger deal. And the economics of platforms differs a little bit from the economics of typical product markets, in that the owners of platforms are going to be looking to price on multiple sides of the market. They're going to be looking to price contributors to the platform, readers of the platforms, people interacting with the platform, and they're going to be looking for lots of ways of monetizing the use of the platform. And I think it's going to be important to view publishing in that context, that this is a platform, and the owners of that platform will be looking to make money from the various people that are interacting with that platform. And standard economics doesn't always hold. It's quite common for a digital platform to price way below marginal cost on one side of the market if it's going to attract users to the market that can be monetized in other places. So for example, you see Google has got some fantastic products, Google Maps, Google Search, Gmail. These are fantastic products that are free, clearly below marginal cost, clearly huge amounts of investment in there. It's not because necessarily that Google is feeling benevolent to the world that they do that. It's their ability to monetize in other areas that makes it economically viable for them to give products away. So therefore, we come back to open access. To some extent, that is a zero price point on one side of the market. That could be an extremely profitable place to do it, especially if you're making revenue from other places. And as we've heard previously, that's what publishers will be looking to do. Where do you make the revenue from the other places? So we're seeing the emergence of a large number of these platforms. The platform is sold in its entirety. Presently, we're seeing that on the whole it's a all or nothing big deal, and that individual subscriptions or individual products within the platform are typically not being priced individually, which you might see in some of the other digital markets. one of the important things for a platform is, to the extent that you can, trap your customers in, because the more that they're trapped in, the more you can monetize people who want to access them. And so I think we're looking and beginning to see strategies by publishers to try and trap, if you like, one side of the market to be committed to their platform. It's especially happening, I think, for some societies who find that their journals have been disassociated with their readers that's been intermediated by the platform, and they find it very difficult to think about changing because they really don't have anything to move from. That's good policies for a platform, because that's the sort of thing that you want to be doing. The other thing, of course, with a platform is that it can control the types of interactions that the various parties can play and the way that they can interact over the top of it. So therefore, they can control the technologies, what can or can't be posted, what can or can't be interacted on it. And this can put a degree of control over, in the scholarly publishing world, both what is counted as a publication, what is allowed to be published, how people, authors, and readers can interact with the work is going to be determined by the publisher, by the platform, not necessarily the people that are putting out the work. So this is a degree of control that I think we need to be aware of and looking at. So these platforms are getting even bigger now, and so we're seeing the emergence of many more sort of what I'll call cradle-to-grave research platforms, where publishers are trying to create a sort of all-inclusive digital environment that goes from the time that people want to start collaborating, to submitting research bids, through to the collection of the research data on the laboratory desks, to the archiving and the hosting and the searching of it, to the way they collaborate with each other, the repositories where they hold working papers or data. And publishing the final article is a fairly small component of the entire research services that could be being provided by a digital platform. Publishers or platforms moving in that direction suddenly have huge scope to be able to monetize in multiple directions across all sorts of content that's being created and interacted with by all sorts of agents. And they've got the ability to tie, by integrating the technology between these various things, they have the ability, if they want to tie people to the platforms. Of course, that is something that a profit-maximizing platform would be wanting to do. And so I think that there's something that we need to look out for here, or be aware of, that these large cradle-to-grave type research platforms come with a degree of control that the publishers will be able to, the large-scale publishers will be able to manipulate to maintain high profit levels. We've heard several times market forces, and I think what we've seen in the platform and digital world is that market forces find it very difficult to operate in this environment, because there's only a few very large, very powerful platforms. So very quickly skim through some of the lessons that we've maybe learned from other digital platforms. There's only likely to be a very few of them existing. There's going to be consolidation. It's likely that there'll only be maybe two, quite possibly one, dominant platform possibly in a discipline, because the network effects, the disciplines, maybe the interaction between chemistry and history might not be so great. But within the chemistry discipline or within the history discipline, you wouldn't expect to see particularly many platforms. Platforms will have a strong financial incentive to lock people in, and they will have the ability to be able to control the use of the platforms across there. Just very, very quickly, I know I'm getting a bit behind time here. Just a quick cautionary tale. We could look at mobile telephone. What happened there? We had Apple originally had the primary operating system for mobile telephones. Google came in with open source platform. Started off saying open source, this is great. But one of the things that Google has been able to do subsequently is use apps and use their software that goes with Google to be able to control and the entire, what would an open source platform, it's controlled through the use of what the software under Google Play services. And that's allowed them to monetize across the platform through the control over the apps and the software used to interact between the various agents on the platform. So I think as a scholarly community, we need to look out and think about how to create open platforms. And one of them would be to have open access, but also open protocols, and be aware of the use of closed processes across multiple users and the way the control that can give to the interactions on the platform. We need to have some sort of diverse management process over the interactions, and some examples exist. I've got the W3C and IETF and even Wikipedia and Linux and Mozilla are examples of broad-scale open platforms that have survived. We're going to need diverse leadership, and we're going to need a modular approach. And we're going to need to recognize that that's going to need some funding. Presently, as we've heard, the lion's share of the public research funding to open access has gone to the largest commercial publishers. They're the ones who have the most incentive to develop those platforms. So we have to look at how public research funding goes to protect us against those platforms and generate alternative processes. Some things already are doing this, so I list them there. And within a small group of open access publishers, we've started up a thing called Scholar-Led, trying to think about how to create community infrastructure in a broader area, and there's a link to that there. Thank you, Stuart.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Rupert, and thank all of the speakers for sticking absolutely to the minute to your time, so that's great. We've already got quite a few questions, but do please feel free to put them in the chat panel on the right. The first thing just that came up during the first talk, we were asked a question which I think I can clarify quite quickly. Does Gold OA include Creative Commons licenses? The answer to that is yes, it does. Part of the entire notion of open access is to allow maximum reuse. Most open access, Gold Open Access has a CC BY license, I think I'm right in saying, but there are other Creative Commons licenses being used. In terms of the question specifically to the speakers, to Claudio, Claudio, you mentioned Sci-Hub, and there's a question here: what future is Sci-Hub pointing to? Abolishing copyright law? Do you have any comments on that?
Copyright law was not abolished because of Kazaa or Napster, but obviously the economic damage to the recording music industry was very substantial. So no, I don't necessarily think that the two are connected. I just point to the erosion in the value of an industry in terms of its capacity to generate revenues and cash flow. If a number of customers start to make decisions based on the availability of research outside of what's officially allowed. And the anecdotal evidence that I've been picking up over the past year and a half in various conversations is that a rising number of librarians, while pointing out that it's not legal, also point out, but lots of things are available on Sci-Hub, and so that's percolating, and that's something worth bearing in mind.
Okay, thank you. We also have a question here specifically for Rupert. Publishing without APCs, how do you get peer review and quality control? I think the underlying thought there is that you need an income source to support the process of peer review. So do you want to just briefly address that one?
Yeah, so we have income sources from multiple places which are not APCs. That's the first. And clearly we have costs and we have to sustain them. And just very briefly, I think the biggest part of our business model is the ability to keep down costs so that we don't have to earn so much to break even. As far as quality control, peer review is a process. It's really not, for books, it's not particularly difficult to manage a peer review process. It's really important that we get high quality reviewers coming in, and we do exactly the same process as everybody else. I don't think the funding stream alters at all the processes by which you establish and maintain quality. Those are really critical, but they're not at all tied to your funding stream.
Okay, thank you. Another question is about the variation across different fields and countries. I'll put this out to all three of you. How does economic innovation in open access publishing differ in the sciences from the humanities and from the global north to the global south? Does anybody want to jump in on that one?
Okay, Stuart, I'll take a start. I mean, there's clearly substantial differences between the humanities and the sciences and the south and the north. One of the fundamental differences between the humanities and the sciences is that we often don't see specific research funding being given to the humanities or to researchers in the humanities, and therefore there aren't the additional funds available, whether direct to the researcher or available from funders specifically to support open access for those domains. That's part of the reason why I said that one model is clearly not going to fit all. I'm not sure that gold is a good route for the humanities or one that can even be delivered. There are examples of collective action. Rupert identified a few of the players in his talk where there is a sustainable model for open access in the humanities. At the moment, it feels to me, again, from the perspective of a large publisher, that green may be more viable, transitional deals may be more viable for the humanities than pure out there gold open access. When it comes to the global south, I do think we have to engage as an industry in some experimentation on a larger scale around potentially market appropriate APCs. I'd also point to some of the fantastic work that groups like SciELO and Africa Journals Online are doing to support open access initiatives from within the regions that those researchers are based.
Thank you. There's another question here specifically for you, Liz. You started with the assumption that there's going to still be a value seen in having journals. Do the other speakers, sorry, this is not really specifically for Liz, it arises from Liz's talk. Do the other speakers agree that the case is made that there is a value in having journals?
From an economic point of view, I will underline what I said earlier. A journal still makes sense as a way to attract a relatively large number of people for the handful of journals which have large readerships. It's very unclear that there is a need for journals per se beyond that constituency from a strictly economical point of view.
Thank you.
I can come in. I think there's several roles that a journal has got and each of those roles are really important. It doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be bundled. And so one of the important roles that a journal has got is assisting readers in discovering content in their field. And if you've got a lot of content that's widely available, readers don't have the time to trawl through it all to work out what is valuable to read, and so that sort of discovery service is going to remain. It's going to be really important. Similarly, journals have been good, and there was a question coming through with this about curating particular subject areas and encouraging subject areas. And again, that role, whether it's done by a journal or not, but that role of curating and supporting particular areas and research in those areas remains important. But it could be done by meta-organizations, scholarly societies, or the like, without being specifically tagged to a particular publisher. And third, of course, is the quality control, the peer review that we've heard about before, and the undertaking of that, which is also very important. But again, there could be other ways of doing that rather than say it's all done by the publisher. finally, as far as a commercial platform, if I take the platform hat on, a brand is very, very useful to me. If people want my brand, then I'm able to monetize it. And so a journal as a brand is a very useful monetizing device as well. And so there's lots of different roles of journals. They're all important in different ways, but I'm not sure that they need to be bundled together anymore.
Okay, thank you. Liz, would you like to come in on that one?
Yes. So I should have qualified my statement by saying, yes, I absolutely still see a continued and valuable role for journals in the future in the context of a broadening of what scholarly communication means, both in terms of the kinds of outputs, preprints someone mentioned earlier, there's all sorts of other things, data having a life and a value of its own and so on. So I see a broader landscape for what scholarly communications mean, of which journals remain a valuable part.
Okay, thank you. We've also had a question referring to the forthcoming European research platform. This is obviously an example of one of the funder platforms I mentioned at the beginning. Does anybody want to comment on that? I don't think we've got an answer yet as to who's going to provide it, but the principle is I think, worth discussing.
I mean, I'm happy to chip in, given I'm talking about platforms all the time. I think we're going to see more and more of these, with funders saying, listen, we don't want to be involved in the APCs so directly, that we can do this more efficiently ourselves, and therefore we have got a baseline platform that we're putting in there. I think there's two things to that. If we go for the slightly bigger mega platform, then we're going to see the ability to discover these, the ability to interact with the data in them, the ability to host them in various settings, in the researchers' settings, that it could get tied to the technologies of particular platforms. And so I think there is a danger that if we don't have fairly open standards that allow the data and things to be interacted with, that they could be technologically sidelined because of by bringing researchers into particular technologies. So personally, I think they're great and really good, but they're going to rely on technologies being able to interact with them.
Right, right. I mean, I think one other thing to say about funder platforms, and indeed most of the alternative platforms, is that whilst we've still got the reward system that we have in academia, which very much depends on publishing in high-branded or high-prestige journals, it seems to me there's always going to be a chilling effect on the use of alternative platforms unless funders at some point decided to make those mandatory for their grantees. Do you think that's possible?
It is what I referred to earlier. The academic administrations have to change how they behave. So far, they look more like the Politburo of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, in the early 90s, or sorry, the early 80s, in the mid 80s, to be more precise. They don't seem to want to change. It's very expedient the way it is. But if you talk to anybody in academia, they'll tell you the system is fundamentally flawed. We'll see where it breaks.
Yeah, sure. A question for Rupert as well, specifically. What do you think is the economic future of the academic monograph or book? Do you see this the same as you've been describing?
Yeah, I mean, the monograph is a hugely important part of research output for very, very many disciplines. That longer form dialogue is there. And so I can't see that going away. I can see it being expanded as you increase multimedia content and you increase engagement that goes with that. But yes, fundamentally, one's seeing now most of the publishers are integrating their e-books with their journals to have some sort of integrated digital platform. So I think the basic point is the same, that these are looking to be integrated into one big digital platform, and it's just products on that digital platform. So yeah, I think the basic points that I'm making, I think, are just the same.
Right. Okay. We've got a few more minutes. There's a question here again about Plan S. How will Plan S change the economics Liz, that might be something that you want to comment on, given that you've got a lot of skin in the game, as it were, here.
Okay. I think the answer is going to lie somewhere in the implementation plan that we're expecting to emerge in a few months' time. It depends partly on APC caps. I talked about those a bit at the beginning of this session. It depends partly on what is meant by transitional or transformational deals being permitted for publication for some period, but then hybrid disallowed, for example. It depends on how many more funders sign up to it and commit to the principles that are contained within it. So at the moment, I'd say it's a combination of we don't know and it depends, but without doubt, it is going to have an impact on the economics of the system. It's really tough to predict right now. It will push more scholarly research towards open access. I think that's probably the best I can say. And open access, also, as I mentioned earlier, has different financial characteristics than subscription publishing, typically lower revenues per article, and so on. We've got to figure out yet how the implementation activities are going to really affect the economic picture.
Thanks. Sort of related to that question, we've already been hearing in some quarters from some academics that they feel that Plan S infringes their academic freedoms, as in their freedom to publish exactly where they want. Rupert, I wonder if you'd like to say something about that. Do you think that's a well-founded concern, or do you think academic freedom perhaps means something else?
I mean, I think maintaining diversity of publishing outlets and allowing people to choose the publishing outlets, as an academic, I think that's really critical. And so, you know, to the extent I personally have always had problems with mandates, and I think that the Plan S has got. I really like the fact that when putting the pressure down and saying, listen, we need to be out publishing, and I think that research funders have got a right to be able to say, we want things to go out this way if you want our funding. So I think there is complete right for researchers to say this is how we want to be output. But I also think it's there for academics to say, well, I don't want the research funding that way if I really want to be doing it in other ways. And we need to have a diversity of processes that facilitate diversification.
Yeah. So just one final thought from me on that. I mean, I think it surely has to be a balance between the understandable desire of the funder to maximize the impact of the research they've funded, balanced with the desires and the needs of the researcher who's done the work to disseminate it in the way they feel most appropriate in the venue they want. That's perhaps a good point to close, as we're now at a little bit over time. Thanks again to all the speakers. I think that's been a really great collection of talks, and thank you all for listening out there. So thanks again, and hope you're at the next OASPA webinar.